All right, the sword. This was actually a second attempt. The first attempt was made out of wood, and it was the more ornate version from Twilight Princess, etc., Breath of the Wild. But I just wanted to see if I could do it and how much over my head I was going to be. It ended up being not that bad. I mean, it was obviously incomplete, just again, because I wanted to see how I was going to be able to execute it. That actually turned out pretty good. But for the most part, this was just the first weekend. Again, I wanted to see how much work I had ahead of me, which I grossly underestimated because I've been working on this all year. I thought it was only going to take a couple of weekends, but... So the sword, the blue stuff is sheet acrylic. That's just the layer on top of it. And cut it into strips. There are 3 layers of 1/4-inch acrylic and then glued them together. The guard was 1/2-inch Delrin and 1/16-inch aluminum that I just shaped, and the aluminum was a little bit bigger, but I waited until I had everything secured to shape it properly. The pommel was an old MHS blade holder 6, I believe, that's been through a whole bunch of people, and I just held the threading to the oscillating spindle sander to grind it down. So this was, again, just progress. The tang, which was eventually going to be like where the battery sits and where everything gets secured to, ended up being sufficient. But again, I had to cut a whole bunch of channels, and I was always worried about how much room I was going to have. The blade, like I said, it was 3 layers of 1/4-inch acrylic, so holy cow, that's pretty thick. And eventually just fed it all to the belt sander to thin it down, which ended up considerably better and lighter. So this is how it ended up being in the end. So it's actually pretty thin. Comparing the two, the second version ended up being a little bit modified to resemble a little bit more of the Ocarina of Time version. I like that one just a tiny bit better, and on top of it there was a little bit more room to fit all the stuff inside of it. I had to mark it off for where the screw holes were going to be. And then once I had it secured down, these are all 3mm screws, then I could go through and even everything up and, again, get all the layers matching on the sides and stuff. So from here, that's where it started to really look a little bit better. The grip was 1-inch aluminum that I just cut a slot in and then screwed it on, and since it was 1 inch, then it would fit inside the pommel. There was going to be a couple of layers afterwards, but for the time being, this is how it ended up looking. So I used Delrin, and I was able to carve out those spaces for the recharge port. The main power switch was just a slider, and the prism, which is a version 5. At this point, I wasn't sure whether or not I was going to use a single emitter or a NeoPixel, but that right there kind of told me, okay, let's go with the NeoPixel just because of how crappy that looks. Triforce, I just cut the Triforce out, taped it down, and then used a little micro engraver to get the, well, skipping ahead a little bit, I guess. This was the jewel for the beak, quote-unquote beak. Okay, back to the Triforce. I used the micro etcher to get that down so that it would leave enough divots so that when I had the layers and stuff on top of it, I could actually see where the triangles were and I could cut through. And it looks good. And unfortunately, I couldn't leave it to just look like that because you can see there's trenches on the top and the bottom of it, and that's to make room for the NeoPixel strip, the LEDs. So I had to cut a big, huge trench that goes alongside the triangles, and yeah, it looks bad here, but it got covered up with the foil tape, and it ended up looking okay. It kind of covered it up, and the weathering didn't hurt either. So, all right. So the powder coating. This is the same powder coating gentian blue that I used for Captain America, and the layers was 1 tube of 1 1/8, and then 1 1/4 was what I used for the actual grip, and the same technique that I used for the Minas Morgul, Minas Tirith, just used foil tape for the contours underneath the rubber, and then heat shrink rubber on top of that. This isn't even all the screws. I had a lot of screws on this. And put together, it looks nice. There was a couple of reverse set screws in there holding the grip together. There's brass screws holding the switch plates on, and then another reverse set screw that's holding the pommel on. The same sun gold that I used for the Triforce. It looked really good having a little bit more angular jewel, and again, with the more industrial look of the guard, it ended up working in the end. So it took me a while to get the NeoPixel to fit, or at least to get it to this point. I had to go back and carve a little bit more out, or I had to tweak it a little bit to get it to fit in, and the wiring, routing the wiring around the triangle was a little bit of an ordeal, getting those measured just right, but again, nothing I haven't done in the past as far as cram foo. It's just sometimes that tedious work gets a bit tedious. Couple of layers of clear coat, one to get the clarity back once I had carved everything out instead of having to polish all that inside. I just get a squirt of gloss clear coat to get the clarity back so that the LEDs will be able to shine through and fill the blade a little bit. And then afterwards there was another clear coat of matte to get some of the diffusion into it. So overall there was 4 layers, not to mention how many coats there were, but there were actually 4 layers of clear coat on this. And once I dirtied it, then it really started to look the way I wanted it to. And honestly, I just like weathered because it gives it so much more depth. And it looks better, and there's more story. And since I was going with a dirty pedestal, like I was going to be outside, obviously it's going to be a dirty sword too. So, funny thing that happened with the jewel, or the beak, since I used the sun gold, it reacted or responded to the red dye really, really well. So whenever there was a color, again, this is a prism, so whenever there's a color with the red dye active, the beak actually shines a little bit red, and it really accentuates the red, which I liked a lot. So the sound font, as I'm clicking through these pictures, the sound font, I liked elements of all of the games, particularly Skyward Sword and Twilight Princess had some really cool concepts. I wanted to somehow incorporate the Dominion Rod too, but that has potential to be its own separate font altogether. Either way, the whole Gale Boomerang I thought was a really cool concept, so I threw that in there. The Skyward Strike, again, I thought that was cool just because of like the shooting of the sword thing, and I almost used like the old 8-bit sounds from the original games, but I decided to, no, let's not do that. Had to construct the hook shot, the arrow, and the Bombchu, just because all the other sounds that I pulled directly from the game actually had background in it, so I had to play with it a little bit to get it right. But I just used the existing sword sound font that I had from the Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul that ended up being Captain of Gondor and Night Wraith, with the weathering and just the overall lighting and how the lighting and it fills the blade really, really well. Again, I'm very, very happy with how it's turned out. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next project. All right, later.